In this video, we're going to look at some various looping structures. Now, the actual looping structures in Ruby are pretty rudimentary. They're not as sophisticated as other languages, and you might at first think, well, that's not good, because it's such a neat language otherwise. Why would it have such weak looping structures? And in reality, the only really clearly defined looping structure is the while looping structure, where you can just generally loop. And here is its structure. Here we have a while, and then we have a Boolean test condition of I greater than 0. It's going to keep looping while this is true. As soon as this is false, it's going to quit. Now you notice I'm going to take out this statement here. Actually, I'll just comment this statement out. So the little hash mark is comments, by the way, if I've never said that before. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this program, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to have my fingers sitting on the control C, and you'll see why in a second. I just created an endless loop by doing that. Look at that. All it did was count up. It doesn't need how fast it counts up. It's a pretty fast little language when you think about it. It filled up my terminal buffer even. So that's not a good behavior unless it's doing something like accepting input or monitoring, like a mouse. That's an endless kind of loop thing. Now let's run it and see what happens. Oops. I think I forgot to save it. Yep. Try it now. There we go. Now we get some good behavior there. So essentially all these guys, all these different little things here, let's put some comments here, are just counting up from 1 through 9. And so we just see a couple varieties of a way to do that. And I'm just going to comment this up real quick here. So that's a while loop, and it's pretty general. And I'll talk about this break statement in a second. We'll come back to that. Let's go down here for the for in. Now, here's a for in where there's not really a true for next loop that you might have seen in other languages. You can use a for in kind of in that way where you have this variable in 1 through 9, and then you can reference that, that variables we see here, how I'm doing it here, just referencing inside the loop here, var. And again, remember your scope. This var is only going to have a value inside this scope. Outside of it, it's not going to have a value. It's not declared to be anything. And that just counts up to 9. That's our second line right here. It counts up 1 through 9. So here's the while loop one. Here's our for in loop. And by the way, this file is 0904. So now we have this interesting method call. Remember, we've said this in other videos, but everything's an object. So this object is an integer, and it has a method attached with it called times. So that allows you to do a loop, and it essentially accomplishes the same thing as this. However, one caveat. Remember, in computers, counting starts at 0. So you'll notice that this one goes 0 to 8. That's 9 times, but it's 0 through 8. These other loops, 2 loops up here and the ones below, I have explicitly declared to go from 1 to 9. So if I wanted this to go from 1 to 9, I'm going to have to do a little bit of jumping around to get that to work the way I want it to. Maybe a conditional in here, but you're probably better off if you need to go 1 through 9 to do it this way. Our next one is probably one way to do it, I guess, is up to. So you can go 1 up to 9. Same kind of setup, this block setup with a do and then a variable that you're going to assign the loop counter to. And that gets us our behavior that we want, 1 through 9. So that's one way to do it, as opposed to this one. And again, this is a method call. The difference here is it accepts, or it actually needs, an argument passed to it of saying, well, 1 up to what? Well, 9 in this case. Finally, down here we have step. Now, step is pretty similar to up to, except that it takes 2 inputs. The first one is the up to part, but the second one here is, well, what's the step? So if we look at our output here, we're going 1, 4, 7. So our steps are 3. So we got 1, and 1 plus 3 is 4, and 4 plus 3 is 7. 7 plus 3 is 10, but we're already outside of our 9 here, so we get 1, 4, 7. So that's kind of like, I've seen some structures where you have, in other languages, where you have a for next loop, and you can have a step parameter in here. That's how you accomplish it. And you'll notice these are method calls on the object. So as long as your object has some kind of, can be enumerated in some way, in other words, you can count through it, such an array or a number or anything like that, or even maybe even a string has some of these attributes, you can go ahead and issue that method call on these to get these outputs. Now, one quick thing on the break. The break just knocks us outside of a loop. It doesn't have any kind of conditional thing. If I comment this out real quick here and run this, it's just going to boom, it's just going to do one loop. Because I set to 1, prints it out, well, it adds 1 to it, but we're not going to print it again, and then hits that break and exits out of this loop here. So that's what the break does. It just, boom, kills the immediate loop and gets you out of there. So that's a little bit about looping expressions in